Hello, today I'll be telling you about Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most prolific executioner. A lot's known about Albert, but did you know he was shipped out to Europe to hang all the Nazis convicted of war crimes and that he was a lovable pub landlord? I'm Mouch, this is Crime Stories.
Albert Pierrepoint was born in 1905 in the Clayton area of the West Riding of Yorkshire. His mum was a housewife to 5 children and his dad was a drunk who just bummed from job to job. He was an official hangman for the Home Office, a job that didn't have steady pay, so times were hard. He was paid per hanging and got no benefits, no pension and no pay for downtime. He was eventually struck off for turning up to work drunk and getting angry at his assistant, but his young son, Albert, already knew he wanted to follow his father's footsteps. But it wasn't until he was 27 that his uncle Tommy, his dad Henry's brother, took him on as an assistant executioner. The job came with a huge responsibility. Executioners were expected to be pillars of society, be responsible at all times and never bring the job into ill repute. This was reflected in the way they were paid. Pierrepoint was paid £1.11 on the day of execution and 2 weeks later another payment of £1.11 when the county high sheriff was satisfied that his conduct and behaviour was satisfactory. He spent 4 days training at London's Pentonville prison, practising hanging a dummy. All he had to do now was to sit and wait to be called up for his first execution. Executioners were allowed to pick their own assistant, so Albert's uncle Tom picked Albert for his first execution out in Ireland. They travelled together to Mountjoy Prison in Dublin, where they would hang young Patrick McDermott, a young Irish father who'd murdered his father. The hanging was set to take place at 8 a.m. All Albert had to do as the assistant executioner was to take the prisoner up onto the scaffolding, bind his legs, put the noose around his neck, put him over the trapdoor and step back whilst the lead executioner pulled the lever to set the mechanism going. For the rest of the 1930s, Albert worked as a grocer in the Failsworth area of Greater Manchester. It wasn't until 1940 till he'd get his big break and finally become a proper executioner. This opportunity came when Albert was the assistant executioner in the execution of Udham Singh, a Punjabi refugee who had been convicted of shooting the colonial administrator Sir Michael O'Dwyer. The day before the execution, Stanley Cross, the newly promoted lead executioner, became confused with his calculations of drop length, and Pierrepoint stepped in to advise those on the correct measurements. Pierrepoint was added to the list of head executioners soon after. In October 1941, Pierrepoint undertook his first execution as lead executioner when he hanged the gangland leader Antonio Babe Mancini. He followed the routine established by Home Office guidelines and as followed by his predecessors. He and his assistant arrived the day before the execution, where he was told the height and weight of the prisoner. He viewed the condemned man through the Judas hole in the door to judge his build. Pierrepoint then went to the execution room, normally next to the condemned cell, where he tested the equipment using a sack that weighed about the same as the prisoner. He calculated the length of the drop using the Home Office table of drops, making allowances for the man's physique if necessary. He left the weighted sack on the rope to ensure the rope was stretched and it would be readjusted in the morning if necessary. In 1943, Pierrepoint married Anne Fletcher after a courtship of 5 years. He did not tell her about his role as executioner until a few weeks after the nuptials. When he was flown to Gibraltar to hang 2 saboteurs, on his return he explained the reason for his absence, and she accepted it, saying she had already known about his second job all along, after hearing local gossip. In late 1945, following the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp and the subsequent trial of the camp's officials and functionaries, Pierrepoint was sent to Hamelin, Germany, to carry out the executions of 11 of those sentenced to death, plus 2 other German war criminals convicted of murdering an RAF pilot in the Netherlands in March 1945. He disliked any publicity connected to his role and was unhappy that his name had been announced to the press by General Sir Bernard Montgomery. When he flew to Germany, he was followed across the airfield by the press, which he described as being as unwelcome as a lynch mob. He was given the honorary military rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and on the 13th of December he first executed the women individually, then 2 men at a time. Pierrepoint travelled several times to Hamelin, and between December 1948 and October 1949 he executed 226 people, often over 10 a day, and on several occasions groups of up to 17 over 2 days. In September 1946, Pierrepoint travelled to Graz, Austria, to train staff at Carlisle prison in the British form of long drop hanging. Previously, the Austrians had used the shorter drop, leaving executed men to choke to death, rather than use the faster long drop kill. He undertook 4 double executions of prisoners, with his trainees acting as assistants. Despite Pierrepoint's expertise as an executioner and his experience with hanging the German war criminals at Hamelin, he was not selected as the hangman to carry out sentences handed down at the Nuremberg trials. The job went to an American, Master Sergeant John C. Woods, who was relatively inexperienced. The press was invited to observe the process, and pictures were later circulated which suggested the hangings had been poorly done. Wilhelm Keitel took 20 minutes to die after the trapdoor opened. The trap was not wide enough, so some of the men hit the edges as they fell. More than one person's nose was torn off in the process, and others were strangled rather than having their necks broken. After the war, Pierrepoint left the delivery business and took over the lease of the pub, to help the poor struggler on Manchester Road in the Hollingwood area of Oldham. In the 1950s he left the pub and took a lease of the larger Rose and Crown at Much Hole near Preston, Lancashire. He later said he changed his main occupation because "I wanted to run my own business so that I should be under no obligation when I took time off. I could take a 3 o'clock plane from Dublin after conducting an execution there and be opening my bar without comment at 5:30. In early January 1956, Pierrepoint travelled to Manchester for another execution and paid staff to cover the bar in his absence. He spent the afternoon in the prison calculating the drop and setting up the rope to the right length. That evening the prisoner was given a reprieve. Pierrepoint left the prison and, because of heavy snow, stayed overnight in a local hotel before returning home. 2 weeks later he received a cheque for his travelling expenses, but not his execution fee. He wrote back to the prison commissioner, and the prison commissioner says he needs to speak to the High Sheriff. Upon speaking to the sheriff, he was told he only gets paid per execution. Instead of getting his full £15 execution fee, he was given travel expenses only. He later requested the full fee, but was only given £4 as a compromise. This didn't sit well with Albert, because it left him out of pocket. His response to that was to leave with immediate effect, therefore ending his career as an executioner. Later, the sheriff did write to the Home Office and request that Albert be paid in full, and he did eventually receive his full £15 fee, but it was too late. He was happy to retire, and so he did. Rumours soon circulated that Albert had spoke to the press and was given £40,000 to give weekly stories to the Daily Chronicle. The government considered suing Albert for breaking the Official Secrets Act, but upon looking further there was a lot of discrepancies in the stories, and they believed that the stories had just been made up and threatened to sue the newspaper instead. He went on to have a nice quiet retirement in the sleepy seaside town of Morecambe in the northwest of England. He wrote a memoir, Pierrepoint, an autobiography. I'll leave a link in the description to somewhere you can read the book. There's also a film been made of his life by Timothy Spall called Pierrepoint, but the book I recommend It's called Pierrepoint, A Family of Executioners by Steve Fielding, which tells the stories of not only Albert, but Tommy and Henry too.
Thank you for your time, and I'll see you next time.